Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise as advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. Disclaimer over. So I thought I'd talk a bit today about what I don't know about depression, and specifically the depression as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition text revision, the DSM-5 TR for short. I'm looking at the major depressive disorder on page 183. I thought we'd go through some of the criteria of what that is, and then skip ahead to page 191, where it talks a little bit about differential diagnoses. And then I also have some statistics for you today on the prevalence of major depressive disorder among adults in the United States of America. So let's dive into it. The diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder has A, B, and C, O, and D, and E. Let me skip ahead just to look. Yeah, okay. So it has A, B, C, D, and E. And under A, it says 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either 1, depressed mood, or 2, loss of interest or pleasure. Note, do not include symptoms that are clearly attributable to another medical condition. And we'll dive more into that in a bit with the differential diagnosis. So number 1 says depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated either by subjective report, so for example, feeling sad, empty, hopeless, or an observation made by others, for example, appearing tearful. And note, in children and adolescents, it can also be an irritable mood. Number 2, it says markedly diminished interest in pleasure, diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated either by subjective account, so that's personal report, or observation, a parent seeing a child. Number 3, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, for example, a change of more than about 5% of body weight in a month, or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. Note, in children, consider failure to make expected weight gain. Number 4, insomnia or hypersomnia every day. Hypersomnia is, I believe, sleeping more than, don't quote me on this, maybe 11 or 12 hours. I don't really recall the definition. But number 5, it says psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day, observable by others, not merely subjective feelings of restlessness or being slowed down. 6, fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. And that's different than your normal everyday tired and stress. 7, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, which may be delusional, nearly every day, not merely self-reproach or guilt about being sick. Number 8, diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day, either by subjective account or as observed by others. And then 9, recurrent thoughts of death, not just fear of dying, but recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or a suicide attempt or specific plan for committing suicide. So if you remember, that's all A, 1 through 9 was A criteria, and that has 5 or more of those 9 that I just read off present. And then the next one is B. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. C, the episode is not attributable to the, this is a difficult word, physiological effects, that's right, physiological effects of a substance or other medical condition. And it has a note here that criteria A through C represent a major depressive episode. And it also has a note that responses to significant loss, for example, bereavement, financial ruin, losses from natural disaster, a serious medical illness or disability, may include feelings of intense sadness, rumination about the loss, insomnia, poor appetite, and weight loss, as noted in criteria A, which may resemble a depressive episode. Although such symptoms may be understandable or considered appropriate in the loss, the presence of a major depressive episode, in addition to the normal response to a significant loss, should be carefully considered. This decision inevitably requires the exercise of clinical judgment based on the individual's history and cultural norms of the expression of distress in the context of loss. And it does have a footnote there that says, in distinguishing grief from major depressive episode, it's useful to consider that in grief, the predominant affect is the feelings of emptiness and loss, while in a major depressive episode, it is a depressed mood and the inability to anticipate happiness or pleasure. So that's an important distinction to make there. And then D, the second to last criteria for major depressive disorder, is at least one major depressive episode is not better explained by schizoaffective disorder and is not superimposed on schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, or other specified and unspecified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. Finally, E, there has never been a manic episode or a hypomanic episode. Note, this exclusion does not apply if all the manic-like or hypomanic-like episodes are substance-induced or are attributable to the physiological effects of another medical condition. So those are the criteria A through E for major depressive episode. And then the differential diagnosis is where it talks a little bit about some of the other things. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but let's see how far we go. So it says manic episodes with irritable mood or with mixed features. Major depressive episodes with predominant irritable mood may be difficult to distinguish from manic episodes with irritable mood or with mixed features. This distinction requires careful clinical evaluation of the presence of manic symptoms to meet the threshold criteria. So for example, 3 if mood is manic, 4 if mood is irritable but not manic. And then bipolar 1, bipolar 2, or other specified bipolar-related disorder. So major depressive episodes, along with a history of manic or hypomanic episodes, preclude the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Major depressive episodes with a history of hypomanic episodes and without a history of manic episodes indicates a diagnosis of bipolar 2 disorder, whereas major depressive episodes with a history of manic episodes with or without hypomanic episodes indicate the diagnosis of a bipolar 1 disorder. On the other hand, presentations of major depressive episodes with history of periods of hypomania that do not meet criteria for a hypomanic episode may be diagnosed as either other specified bipolar and related disorder or major depressive disorder, depending on where the clinician judges the presentations best fall. For example, the presentation may be considered other specified bipolar and related disorder because of the clinical significance of the subthreshold hypomanic symptoms, or the presentation may be considered as a case of major depressive disorder with some subthreshold hypomanic symptoms in between episodes. So depressive disorder due to another medical condition, that does happen. A diagnosis of depressive disorder due to another medical condition requires the presence of an etiological medical condition. Major depressive disorder is not diagnosed if the major depressive-like symptoms are attributable to the direct psychophysiological consequence of a specific medical condition, for example, multiple sclerosis, stroke, hypothyroidism. And then it says substance/medication-induced depressive disorder. This disorder is distinguished from major depressive disorder by the fact that the substance, for example, a drug abuse, a medication, a toxin, appears to be etiology related to the mood disturbance. For example, depressed mood that occurs only in the context of withdrawal from cocaine would be diagnosed as cocaine-induced depressive disorder. Next, it has listed as persistent depressive disorder, which is characterized by depressed mood, more days than not, for at least 2 years. If criteria met for both major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder, both can be diagnosed. And then there's premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And that is characterized by dysphoric mood that is present in the final week before the onset of menses, that starts to improve within a few days after the onset of menses, and that becomes minimal or absent in the week post-menses. By contrast, the episodes of major depressive disorder are not temporally connected to the menstrual cycle. Depressive mood dysregulation disorder. So this is characterized by severe recurrent temper outbursts manifested verbally and or behaviorally accompanied by persistent or labile mood most of the day, nearly every day, in between the outbursts. In contrast, major depressive disorder, irritability is confined to the major depressive episodes. Then it says major depressive episodes superimposed on schizophrenia, delusional disorder, schizophreniform disorder, or other specified, unspecified schizophrenia spectrum or psychotic disorder. Depressive symptoms may be present during those that I just mentioned and other psychotic disorders. Most commonly, such depressive symptoms can be considered associated features of the disorders and do not merit a separate diagnosis. However, when the depressive symptoms meet full criteria for major depressive episode, a diagnosis of other specified depressive disorder may be made in addition to the diagnosis of a psychotic disorder. So schizoaffective disorder, it says it differs from major depressive disorder with psychotic features by the requirement that in schizoaffective disorder, delusions or hallucinations are present at least 2 weeks in the absence of major depressive episode. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Distractibility and low frustration can both occur, and low frustration tolerance can occur in both ADHD and major depressive episode. If the criteria for both are met, ADHD may be diagnosed in addition to the mood disorder. However, the clinician must be cautious not to overdiagnose major depressive episode in children with ADHD whose disturbance in mood is characterized by irritability rather than by sadness or loss of interest. So we got 3 more. Adjustment disorder with depressed mood. A major depressive episode that occurs in response to a psychosocial stressor is distinguished from an adjustment disorder with depressed mood by the fact that the full criteria for major depressive episode are not met in adjustment disorder. Bereavement. So bereavement is the experience of losing a loved one to death. It generally triggers a grief response that may be intense and may involve many features that overlap with symptoms characteristics of a major depressive episode, such as sadness, difficulty sleeping, and poor concentration. Features that help differentiate a bereavement-related grief response from a major depressive episode include the following. The predominant affects in grief are feelings of emptiness and loss, whereas in major depressive episode, they are persistent depressed mood and diminished ability to experience pleasure. Moreover, the dysphoric mood of grief is likely to decrease in intensity over days to weeks and occurs in waves that tend to be associated with thoughts or reminders of the deceased, whereas the depressed mood in major depressive episode is more persistent and not tied to a specific thought or preoccupations. It's important to note that the vulnerable individual, for example, someone with a past history of major depressive disorder, bereavement may not only trigger a grief response, but also the development of an episode of depression or worsening of the existing episode. Lastly, it says sadness. Finally, periods of sadness are inherent aspects of the human experience. These periods should not be diagnosed as major depressive episode unless criteria are met for severity, i.e. 5 out of the 9 symptoms. Duration, i.e. most of the day, nearly every day for at least 2 weeks, and clinically significant distress or impairment. The diagnosis other specified depressive disorder may be appropriate for presentations of the depressed mood with clinically significant impairment that do not meet the criteria for duration or severity. So lastly, I did want to touch on the statistics about the prevalence of the major depressive episodes among adults in America. And so I am looking at a website on the National Institute of Mental Health. It's a .gov, nimh.nih.gov. And I'll put the link in the show box description thingy. But it says an estimated 21 million adults in the United States had at least one major depressive episode in 2021. This number represents 8.3% of all US adults. That's a pretty big number. It says the prevalence of major depressive episodes were higher among females at 10.3% compared to males at 6.2%. And the prevalence of adults with a major depressive episode was highest among individuals aged 18 to 25, which I believe is Generation Z. I could be wrong on that. And the prevalence of major depressive episode was highest among those reporting to have 2 or more races, and that was at 13.9%. So I thought those were some interesting statistics to share, and if you want to support the show, click the button on the website, and remember, I appreciate each and every one of you simply for existing.